everybody. This is Jackie here with the Sexy Politico, and today we're here with the Honorable Paul Johnson of the Optimistic American. Now, Paul, can you tell us a little bit more about the Optimistic American and what you and your business partner, I'm assuming, are doing with the Optimistic American?
Sure. So my partner in the podcast is Dr. Emily Basha. She's a psychologist. She and I just finished writing a book that was called Addictive Ideologies, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But the single biggest issue that we've been focused on in the Optimistic American is Americans are losing their sense of agency. Right? They're constantly looking at the problems and the things that they see that are going wrong or that aren't as good as they hoped that they would be. They're listening to the news on a nightly basis or delving into their social media, and all they're hearing is dread. Well, the reality is, to gain back a sense of agency, you have to know the truth. And the truth is, we're in an unbelievable position as a country. We face some of the greatest opportunities as individuals that any human species have ever faced in the history of the planet. If you look at what we've been able to do to reduce poverty in the world and illiteracy in the world, what we've been able to do to reduce child mortality rates. There's so much that we've done well that we've put together a program to talk about those things. In fact, I kind of taken it on the road. I have a speech that I give that's designed around trying to help people think about what they're naming as the big challenges and helping them put it into perspective. In the book that we wrote, by the way, optimistic does not mean that you're Pollyannish, right? It doesn't mean that you ignore problems. There are problems. There are challenges that we have. But if you look at us historically, those problems as Americans, we've continued to tackle them and to grapple with them and to improve upon them. There's evidence here that tells us that we can be optimistic about the future because of the great gains that we've made over the last 10 years, the last 50 years, the last 500 years as a society. The big challenges, or if you ask me what the biggest challenge is, it is the loss of having a sense of agency, and it's also the divisions that exist in America. Well, part of what drives the divisions is that people go to their nightly news, they turn on whichever channel they watch, which appeals generally to a demographic, a partisan demographic. And it tells them all the problems that are happening in society. Now, here's what happens when you hear those challenges. They know they design them towards your ideology. So on the Democratic side, there's a set of fears that they would normally have. On the Republican side, there are a set of fears that they would have. Each of the news works have kind of divided up sides, figured out which group they want to appeal to. There's this thing called the amygdala hijack. What happens is, for you to be optimistic, for you to be rational, for you to love, for you to be able to be creative or artistic, it takes this frontal portion of the brain, what they call the human portion of the brain, the neocortex, to be able to work. Well, the more primitive portion of the brain is called the amygdala. And the amygdala can actually hijack the neocortex when it's terrified, right? And that what that comes from is it's a very primitive portion of the brain that is designed to protect you. And when it's engaged, it's fight, flight, or freeze. That's basically what we do. And we lose the ability to be optimistic, to be rational. Well, what that means is that you have to spend some time thinking about what's going right. And I can tell you that is very hard to find on the nightly news. It's almost impossible to find if you allow yourself to go down these rabbit holes in social marketing. What I like about podcasts is that podcasts are a whole different group of people who give you more options. Now, there are some podcasts that are just as negative as what you'll see on the nightly news, but there you can get a chance to get more in depth into an issue. And once you start getting in depth into an issue, you start finding that there are some solutions. There are some ways that we can fix those problems. Today in American society, again, I'm not Pollyannish. I recognize there are challenges, but I think if you put it in perspective, there's never been a better time or a better place to be alive than right here and right now. For me, helping people understand that is an absolute key if we're going to start to resolve those divisions. Because if that amygdala hijack is in place, we move to our corners and we become very tribal. That's what happens. And all of a sudden, we start to demonize the other side. And when you demonize the other side, you start to objectify the other side. And at that point, it's a jump ball. The world really can get worse. The key for us is to recognize that most of that is hype, and that where we are and the place that we are in and the time that we're in is a very good place to be alive and to be able to do the things that we'd like to do.
There are things that we can do in 2023 that my ancestors could not even imagine that they'd be able to do. I mean, my ancestors probably couldn't even imagine that I would be able to travel the world before I got married and had children. And we have this freedom and this agency to travel, to see the world, and also to have all of this information in our pockets. And I definitely agree with you. Having too much information sometimes can just overload us in a way, because our social media is very catered to us and our news is very catered to us. My father didn't believe me that his Facebook looked different than my Facebook, and when I showed that to him, he was shocked.
Yeah, so be careful about the incentives that exist for the people who are giving you information, right? They make money from it. When I was mayor, and I've worked in a number of presidential campaigns, and I remember once a pollster told me, look, here's what we need to do to be able to win this race. The first thing that we have to do is we have to terrify our base about the opponent. We have to tell them all the things that would terrify them, because once that amygdala is engaged, they'll never even listen to the other side. And once we've locked down our base, then what we need to go do is to convince the people who are in the middle that the other side's special interests are worse than the special interests on our side. Right?
Yeah.
It's what politicians do, right? Politicians,
Yes.
that's part of they want to win. They want to win their campaign, and they know that the negative bias is powerful. The same thing is true of political parties. Political parties want to appeal to the fear of their base so they can get them to turn out. Well, the same thing is true on the nightly news, right? They're trying to have people who will watch their programming tomorrow. And if they can terrify you enough without giving you a solution, you'll turn that television back on tomorrow to do a follow-up. The same thing happens with people who want more clicks, or you spend more time on social marketing so you can watch their ads. They profit from doing that. Now, I don't see anything that we should do that would try to get rid of those four groups. They all play an important role. I think we just have to understand where they're coming from. And it's not always that their information is a lie, right? If I give you a lot of negative information, it can be truthful, but if it's out of perspective, it's not honest, right? And that's what's happening. It's taken so far out of perspective that it leaves us with a disjointed view, an apocalyptic view of where the future is. Everything becomes existential, right? Everything starts to fall into this category of it's going to be cataclysmic if the Democrats get elected or if the Republicans get elected. And the truth of it is, look, politics has dramatically shifted in the last 20 years since I've been out. 20 years ago, here's what would happen. People would engage about 4 months before the campaign, and they'd get stressed or upset or they do the things that happen in political campaigns, because politics is the place that we go to resolve our problems. But when the race was done, when it was over, they go back to normal life. Well, something happened in the last 20 years, right? There's a 24-hour news cycle, right?
Yep.
Breaking news on a constant basis. Politicians, they don't tweet to you now once a week. They tweet to you sometime once an hour with the latest terrifying thing that you should be upset about, because they want to stay in the center of your attention, right? There's a narcissistic trait that happens with many elected officials, and I put myself into that group, right? That there's the idea that you're out looking to become an elected official. There's a psychology that goes along with it. Hopefully not a psychopathy, but there's a psychology that's engaged with it. So again, you just need to put it in perspective, and you need to start finding other sources of information. Now, that could be about your children, that can be about art or music, that could be even more detail about the political issues. So you start to understand, well, what are solutions to many of these big problems? And then also understanding kind of where the world is. I'm amazed still today how many people think that China is going to overcome the United States, and that we may lose the dollar to the yuan. Right? Today, that's a big debate because they're saying that the Chinese now have begun to trade in petrodollars, and so hypothetically, the yuan might overcome the American dollar. Well, here's the truth. The American dollar is all about the world's reserve currency. People put money, they take their cash, and they put it into reserves. They have to decide, well, do I want to put that in euro or American dollars or the yuan or the yen? Well, when you're making that decision in the United States, if you put it in dollars, the dollar's been going up pretty steadily for 50 years, right? The yuan, they intentionally depress the yuan so they can export more goods. The stronger your currency, the less exports you have. So they deflate it. So if you decide to put your money into the yuan, here's what you get. Every year it's going to go down in value. That's why the yuan only has a 2% of the world's reserve currency, and we're at about 47%. The point I'm giving to you is be careful of the people, because oftentimes they're the people who are trying to get you to buy into gold or trying to get you to buy into other types of devices. They have an economic incentive to sell you on this apocalyptic view. And the reality is, the United States is the greatest superpower in the history of mankind. It's unabashedly so. There's nothing that's ever come close to what we've created. We have 67 different allies around the world, 47 different countries where we have over 400 different bases. We have the largest Navy by far. That Navy patrols all the world's ocean to make certain that free trade is able to work. We've done a lot of good trying to promote democracy in other countries. Certainly, we have issues. I've always been concerned about civil rights and equal rights and human rights. But even on those issues, we have done an incredible amount. I mean, if you look at the world historically for women, the world was filled with teenage brides and honor killings, right? That's a historical norm.
It's still true in some countries.
It absolutely is true in some countries. Now, that's not an excuse to say that we can't make more improvement. Of course we can make more improvement, but put it in perspective and recognize that your opportunities here they're amazing. Now, I believe the reason that that's happened, and this is fundamental for me, I saw government do a lot of good things when I was in office. We built bridges and roadways and schools, police departments, fire departments. The government even put men on the moon, right? But the greatest thing our government ever did from the very beginning was that we empowered the individual over itself, over government. We laid out very early in our process, when the US Constitution, its moral underpinnings, its moral foundation is the Declaration of Independence. And in that document, we said that we hold these truths to be self-evident. We believe that all people are created equal, and that all of them they've come to having a set of rights that they've been endowed upon by God. Well, that actually stretched back to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was having this crisis of faith with the Catholic Church at the time, and he was trying to figure out whether or not indulgences were an okay thing, whether or not people could be able to buy their way out of sin. And he said, no, God can't take a bribe. What he said that was key was that each of us as individuals have a direct connection to God. There's nothing between us and them. Now, here's where that gets interesting. A couple hundred years later, Jean Rousseau and others around him turned that into a secular idea. They said, hey, if God owes you dignity, so does your government. They owe each one of us as individuals that sense of dignity. That's the moral foundation of Western society. That's why we had a civil rights movement and an equal rights movement and a human rights movement, because we believe that each individual is worthy of dignity. Now, I've spent time all around the world. I've been in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. I've been I spent time in Poland. I helped them establish their first local governments after the Soviet Union. And what I can tell you is that we often think as Americans that freedom is a universal value. Here's the answer to that. No, it's not. There are a lot of people around the world who do not put freedom at the top. Some people put religion at the top, but power usually is always, in most other countries, at the top. We've created a government where the individual is at the top. And that gives you an unlimited amount of potential and opportunity. You don't have to believe me on this. Watch immigrants who come into the United States. Watch how they flourish because they see it. They see that opportunity. They see the things that they can do if they just simply save more money than they spend and invest that money into businesses or into assets or into real estate. They begin to recognize that you can grow something that will go way beyond your years. I grew up as a poor kid. I came out of a little place called Sunny Slope, Arizona, which was the second highest poverty pocket in the state. My parents were very poor. They came out of the Appalachians of West Virginia. They were, a waitress and a construction worker when I was young. Now, they built a much better life over time, and I was able to build a much better life also. It came about not because I had any genius to me. It came about because of where I am. It came about because of the people who were around me. It came about because of the opportunities that were here. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. You just have to be willing to stand up and to recognize, stop being afraid. Quit listening to people who are trying to convince you how bad it is and start looking at the opportunities. Look at what you can create. Look at what it is that you can do to innovate or to make something better out of your life. Have you ever heard of Viktor Frankl?
Yeah.
Victor's a favorite of mine. Victor was in Auschwitz. So he was a psychologist. And as a psychologist, he had to deal with the issue of suicide. And so he created this thing called logotherapy, but it was a means to try to give people purpose. Well, when the Nazis came in, he was sent to Auschwitz. And he said that when he went into the camp, it took 9 people to the left, 1 to the right. He was the one that went to the right. He thought that he was going to immediately be killed. He had no way of knowing that it's his family that would be dead within hours. And they put him into a work camp. Right? His deal was he had to work every day, literally in very, very hard labor. He had no idea what had happened to his family. So he had all these people around him, and he said they were on the edge of death. Men that had gone down to 70, 80 pounds in weight. And he said, literally, he tells the story of this one individual who thought they were going to be saved on like March 23rd. And he said he worked and he got his things together. And for weeks and weeks and weeks, he was excited and just knew it was going to happen because it had this dream that they were going to be saved. He said on March 23rd at midnight, he said he died 5 minutes later, right? Because they weren't saved. And because he lost his will to live. That will to live is an important part. Part of having a will to live is finding purpose and meaning. And what he said, what he did with other prisoners, or what he did in logotherapy to help on suicide, was he said that there are 3 areas where we can find meaning. And I add my own 4th. The first one he said is in who and what we love. The second one is in what we create. The third one is how we serve other people. And the fourth one is finding our way through struggle. Right? That's how you begin to find meaning. But you cannot find meaning if you don't understand the importance of your free will, your ability to be able to look at a situation and to see the opportunities, to see the benefit, to not fall into a victim mindset.
Sorry, I'm just processing everything that you've just said. And thinking about, honestly, just thinking about the last 10, 15 years and how much it feels as though people my age are being fed this idea of we've been given the short end of the stick because as most millennials we grew up in the shadow of 9/11, well, Columbine, the shadow of 9/11, the shadow of the first Great Recession, coming out of college with the job market being crap. And then all of these, just this, that, and the other thing, and all of these bad things that have happened. And it's like, and I'm sitting here going, yeah, but then, but we came out of it. Just feels like we're always being told how shitty our lives are.
So be careful about being told, right?
Yeah.
So here's what I will tell you. I think millennials are in the best position of any generation ever. And by the way, I have a lot of millennials who work in our company. I own a healthcare company in Arizona with a couple hundred people and providers that work for us. The younger workers, the millennials, I find them to be fascinating because there are many traits that they have that are much more beneficial than my generation. And one of them is they tend to care more about other people. They tend to be more empathetic, and they care about the group, right? But here's where your big advantage is. So if you look at the world today, you have to say, well, what's happened in the world? Back in the 1970s, we began to open the world up. We opened the world up to China, to Russia. Free trade became a big issue, and free trade really helped in a lot of ways. There were a lot of very good things that came from it. But China has begun to move into a position, and Russia's beginning to move into a position where they want to change the world order. The world order was established in the 1940s by the United States, 1947, because most infrastructure of the world had been destroyed by the war itself. And so we were the only ones with the money and the resources to be able to fix it. But we created a deal with countries that we traded with, that we helped out, that we allowed to sell products into the United States. It was this: you got to pick a side. Right? We had the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and we needed them to pick a side. And so the War of Containment, or the Cold War, went into place. But it finally broke in the 1970s and the 1980s. When the Berlin Wall came down, the world opened up. Well, what's happening today?
The
The
world
United
is
States
wide
deeply
open.
worried. That's right. And we're worried about what's going on with China and Russia. And Russia, now all of their natural resources, they're going offline. All right, we're not going to be buying them. And China, they have a huge demographic problem. The estimates by the United Nations is that they will literally go from 1.2 to 1.3 billion people down to 700 million. They'll cut in half. That's going to mean they're going to have less workers producing less goods. In the meantime, we're getting into a trade war with them. The odds are, not the odds, we believe we need to double industrial production to just be able to keep up with our demand. Now, what's the demand coming from? Well, boomers are retiring, but millennials are coming of age. They're at the stage where they're buying cars, they're buying houses, they're buying disposable goods, they want entertainment. And as they start to buy those things, they're creating demand. And we can't keep up with it from a supply standpoint. So what do we have to do? Increase industrial output. How do we do that? Do more investment in jobs in the United States. What's that going to mean? A lot more jobs. And you and your generation are going to have the ability to be much pickier, or to go into business for yourself and to try to take advantage of it from a business standpoint. If you as a millennial don't understand, you have the greatest opportunity of any generation, that you let somebody trick you. And when they tricked you, they stole your agency. They stole your ability to believe that you have the ability to partially determine your own destiny through how you act, what you believe, and what you're willing to look at. Step out, look at it. It's an opportunity that is greater than any generation before you. You haven't been ripped off. You've been put into a position that, if you're willing, you can make an incredible difference in your life and in the lives of the people around you.
It is. I guess I've just not really seen this opportunity when you're constantly told that your generation's been screwed over, and then Gen Z is starting to come of age, and it's like, well, where does that leave us? But then it's like, I'm 40 years old, almost 40 years old. The beginnings of the millennial generation are going to be taking over in politics very soon. I mean, we're just hitting the correct age. We're hitting the right age
in your life. are between the ages of 40 and 60. Here's the point I would give to you. Everything before 40, it was just practice, right? You were learning, you were beginning to understand, you were beginning to gain a different view of the world. Think about the insecurities that I don't know if you had, but I had when I was 20. When
Oh
I
my
was 20,
gosh.
insecurities were dramatically higher than my 30s, and my 30s were worse than my 40s. As you start to come into your 40s, you start to recognize, okay, to begin with, there's nobody really better than me. There's nobody that really has it any more figured out than me. There's nobody that should have any more opportunities than I have. You start to become aware of yourself, and it is why people make their most money in those years. But you had to go through some practice. You had to see
Yeah.
what worked, what didn't work, and
I
what
just lived overseas for 5 years and got to see a very different point of view, which is a great thing. I lived in Bulgaria from 27 to 29, and then I lived in China for 3 years after that. And I've had a very different point of view. And rather than just see that as hiding for 5 years, that's learning something, a very valuable skill that some people might actually want after as soon as I get my second kid into school.
Yeah, it's again, it's what I'm fascinated by is when you talk about we've been told this, we've been told that. And again, what I would tell you is people benefit and profit from telling you that because it's a victim mindset. If the thing that I'm the most disappointed in politicians today is that they have learned the art of appealing to a victim mindset. So I don't know if you've ever seen the victim triangle, but in the victim triangle, there's the victim at the top. The victim basically believes they have no choices, right? Then over to the side, over to the right side, is what they call the persecutor. It's the person who's always going after the victim, always asking them why they're not doing enough. And then there's the savior. The savior is the person always picking them up and standing them back up and saving them. Interestingly enough, the persecutor believes they're a victim. That's why they're complaining all the time. And the savior, sooner or later, the victim turns on the savior because they said, we didn't save you enough times. And now that you're not going to save you and I didn't know how to do it, you're at fault.
Yeah,
If you want,
that's why everybody blames Obama for everything, because
so if you want,
he was the savior.
start
And
by
then,
looking for your own opportunities. If you're persecuting someone, start thinking about how you can encourage them instead of persecuting them. And if you're a savior, move your role from being a savior to a coach. You can help people, you can give them advice and information, but they have to find their own way. Gosh, I have to figure that out with my kids, right? You have to let them be able to fail. You have to allow them to be able to make their own decisions, to have their own sense of agency. The point that I'm giving to you is politicians have learned how to become that savior, and they're constantly trying to tell the victim, you've been victimized. So in every community, they're doing it. In the women's community, the Black community, the Hispanic community, the white community, the white male community. Every one of them are being told by politicians, you've been harmed. You haven't been treated fair. You got screwed over. Why? Because if you give up your sense of agency and you're afraid, you hand it over to them. And here's the answer. You've been given the greatest opportunity of any human beings in the history of mankind. It's right here in front of you. The issue is, are you going to look at it in a more rational way and figure out where your opportunities are and do something with it? I'm 100% convinced the opportunities today are as good as they've ever been in the United States. I'm also convinced that I've never seen as many people who believed that wasn't true.
yeah. What would you say to someone like me who is about ready to put their kid into public school and is scared to death about gun violence and all of these other things that you are just constantly inundated with in the media about schools in general in the United States?
Well, I face the same thing. I have grandkids and kids that have gone into schools, and believe me, I've gone to the schools to take a look at, like, what does the campus look like, and how safe do I believe they're going to be. So I understand that feeling.
I personally lived through a school shooting
Oh, wow.
at my
Uh,
university. So that's why I'm like I'm very anxious about it, but I also know that the best place for him to go to school is school.
so let me tackle that from a little different position. Let me tackle that from a position of what can we actually do about it? How can we improve upon it? Today, the only argument is should we get rid of AR-15s or not? Now, when I was mayor, I passed a kids' gun law. I had a group of kids who were 11 to 14 years old in the 1990s that went into a skating rink. They pulled their guns out, got into a gunfight, killed a couple of people and a couple of kids that were innocent. As it turns out, when they were going into the skating rink, there was a police officer there. And so the question was, why did you let these kids go in with guns strapped to their hips? And the answer was, as long as the gun's visible, it was constitutional. Of course, my answer was, you got to be kidding me. A 14-year-old can walk around the city with the gun strapped to their hip. So I passed a kids' gun law. I also passed a curfew program to get kids off the street that were under the age of 18. And I passed a school uniform program. It was one where we allowed schools voluntarily to step up and we helped them with the school uniforms. We reduced violent crimes and drive-by shootings by about 70%. I can't tell you which one of those three made the biggest difference. What I can tell you is I got sued in that same week by the NRA and by the ACLU. Right, both groups. I call myself an equal opportunity defendant because I had the right and the law suing me. When I look at the problem today, by the way, I tell you that because I'm telling you, I'm not afraid of the NRA. That's not something that bothers me. But I do care about what works, what's effective, what
Yeah.
are we fighting about, and why are we fighting about that? So the AR-15. Well, about one in 20 people today own an AR-15. About 1 in 4 guns that are sold are AR-15s. There's a huge economic push behind them, and there are a lot of people that now own them that want to keep them. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton passed a law that said that you couldn't sell semi-automatic weapons that lasted a decade. During that decade, an interesting thing happened is that shootings with automatic weapons went down. You have to question, well, why? Why did that happen? Because people still had the guns. They didn't take guns away from people that had them. They only stopped new sales from happening. What we're seeing from that is that most people said, oh, government's going to come take my gun, so they hid it. Well, let's take a look at school shooting numbers. There's a great study. You can go online. You can see there are 180 shooters that have been on school campuses or in synagogues, people who've shot more than 4 people. And they have an incredible amount of information on those individuals. I think the number is about 20% had an automatic weapon, or excuse me, a semi-automatic weapon like an AR-15. Well, the first question you have to ask is, all right, so would that have gotten rid of 20% if you took away the AR-15? Probably not. They probably just would have modified a Glock with an extended clip if that's what they wanted, and you can actually adjust it to making it an automatic weapon. So, not real sure that it would have made any difference. Here's a couple of areas though that I think that's interesting data that you get from that. The first one is out of that 180, all of them but 4 were young males. I think the ages, I'd have to go back and look, but it was like between the ages of 12 and 21 years old. Young white males were most of them. So that's an interesting statistic, an interesting way to identify where's the problem coming from. But here's a second one. They all went through a process. They interviewed a number of people who were involved with it, and they found that there was always a trauma. There was some trauma that was involved in their life. And then after the trauma, they got to a point where they became isolated. And then after becoming isolated, they became depressed and suicidal. Right? We've done a lot of work on suicides in this country. We have a good understanding of how to identify them and also how to work with them. So what's interesting about the data is that of these 180 shooters, not only could you identify the fact that all but 4 of them were white males, young white males, but they could also begin to identify that a number of them were suicidal in their thought process. And again, what they saw is that while they went through this process of first being in a position where they were had some type of trauma in their life, and they got to the stage where they were beginning to become isolated. They then got to the stage where they started having suicidal thoughts or attempted suicide, but then they began to blame someone externally. So oftentimes, almost always, every one of these cases, they knew when they went onto the school campus or into the synagogue, they were going to die that day. It
Yeah.
was a suicide. Well, here's the point. There are things that we can do about that. Right. Now, here's what we know works. Right. I told you a moment ago, safe containment laws work. Getting guns away from the kids in the first place where they can't get to them. Second thing that works are red flag laws, identifying people who have mental illnesses that shouldn't have guns. And then you have to have a administrative process in place that makes certain that people aren't selling them to them. Restraining orders. We don't use restraining orders in this process, but we could, where if you and your parents thought that maybe your brother was becoming a problem, he was getting too tied into violent ideologies, you could go to a judge and ask for a temporary restraining order on him to either be able to buy guns or for anyone to give guns to them, and they can send out notices to people. But we also know that the schools could do a better job of identifying who are the potential problems. And there, you're going to have to spend some time and money on psychiatric help. Now, I've always been a believer. I like school resource officers, but now schools are starting to talk about having multiple school resource officers, more than one. I can tell you in almost all these shootings are a whole group of good guys out in the parking lot with guns. But by the time they get there or get involved, it's too late. The place to solve this is to be involved much earlier in identifying. By the way, the last thing was almost all of these kids who were involved in these shootings came from the school. They weren't an outsider coming in. So it would have been very difficult to identify that somebody shouldn't have been there anyway. Mm-hmm. The point I'm giving to you is none of those things really tackle the issue of the AR-15, nor do I believe that, while I don't really care whether you keep AR-15s or not, I don't believe by getting rid of them, you're going to stop the problem. But I can tell you, there's a huge benefit to both the right and the left, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, to engaging their base on that issue. That's the fault line. That's where both sides want to fight. And both of them want to avoid the more difficult question of, hey, how do we find some common ground that starts to save our kids, that starts to find a way to make certain that they're safe? Unfortunately, in today's system, we're not really incentivizing people to do that. Now, I happen to think that the changes that we need, there are three big changes that we need to happen in American society. The first one is I think we need to change the way our primary system works. We've allowed the political parties to run it, and what that does is it allows extremists on both the right and the left to dominate it. Ranked choice voting, top two, nonpartisan primaries, there's lots of other solutions that have been used in lots of cities around the country where you end up getting a much higher quality candidate and a much higher quality debate between the parties. The second thing that I can tell you I think needs to happen is I'm a big believer that we need to focus on civics in education, because I think we are down on who we are and sometimes we don't respect even where we came from. But the third issue is it's helping people find their own self-agency, to understand that oftentimes, while they should always be careful and they shouldn't avoid the problems, oftentimes these fears are way overblown. And that, in our book, we've laid out, our book was really a study of how does genocide, terrorism, and extremism tie together. And they tie together in that they're all tied to ideologies. They all have an ideological base on the right, the left, or based upon different religious structures. And the second thing that happens is that those ideologies that become violent have a group outlook. They think that the world is filled with the oppressed and the oppressor. And once you start to think that and you start to categorize other groups of people as the oppressor, well, then it becomes easy to objectify them. And then what you do is you remove, all of us have good and evil in us, the ability to do great things and the ability to do bad things. But once you have a group that you've objectified, it's easy to remove that evil from the inside of you and to say, that group is evil. And then it gives you the ability to do other things to them. And last, it becomes like an addiction. My partner, who's a psychologist, has just done a lot of work on this. She spent a lot of time in jails with members of incel and Islamic terrorists, and had clinical patients that are on the right and the left that have been so addicted to the ideology that they've been willing to give up on things that would make them happy or the family members that they love because they're addicted to it. We've laid out in our book what we call the 7 ideals of citizenship, which help give you agency and that are key to being able to solve that. And those include, very shortly, a lot of what we've talked about here: knowing the truth, recognizing the importance of the individual, that you're an individual, you're worthy of dignity, so are other people. You should treat them as a person, not as a part of a group. That you should put that safety should not be above other priorities like freedom of speech and resilience, and making certain that you have we're only going to become stronger if we recognize that listening to people at times that we don't agree with actually helps us become more resilient. Finding meaning and purpose, again, that we talked about here, love and connection, the role that plays in the process, and the fact that you belong to something bigger and better. And by the way, what you belong to, if you're an American today, is something that's awesome.
So where could people find your book?
Our book you can find anywhere. It's called Addictive Ideologies by Dr. Emily Basha and the Honorable Paul Johnson. You can find it on Amazon, is probably the easiest place to find it. And then you can find our podcast where we talk about a lot of these ideas on the Optimistic American, and it's available on all platforms.
That's great. Thank you so much for being on the Sexy Politico. Before we leave, is there anything that you would like to leave the audience with, any sort of message or anything you want to share?
But I'll leave you with something. So you won't remember, you're a millennial, you're too young, but when I was a young man, I was a mayor. By the way, I was a Democratic mayor. I'm an independent today. I had a dinner with Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. Now, these two individuals, one was the president of the United States and the head of the Republican Party. The other was the head of the Democratic opposition.
Yep.
Both of them got along very, very well. At this dinner, I asked Ronald Reagan, what's the single most important thing you can tell me as a young elected official that I need to focus on? And he used to have this nod of his head. He said, well, Mayor, he said, the single most important thing is to remember you have to leave them with hope. When he left, there was a guy named Pierre Salinger who wrote many of John F. Kennedy's speeches. One of the speeches he wrote was, ask not what you can do for what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country.
Great.
And he said to me,
great order.
My gosh, he said, Ronald Reagan and John F. Kennedy, they're so much alike. And I said, what?
Yeah.
Explain this to me. And he said, yeah. He said, look, they're both optimistic. They both believe in the future. They just have a different way of approaching the same problem. Here's what I would tell you. I don't care whether you're on the right or the left and how you're trying to approach the problem. Be optimistic. Leave your vote, leave your constituents, the people who are watching your program, with hope. Don't just fill them with the problems. If you're going to talk about the problems, talk about solutions at the same time, because solution-driven conversation on issues leave people with a belief that maybe we can make this better. If we get people to believing we can make this better, it's going to get a lot better. If people continue to have a sense of doom and gloom, that they fall into what I call the doomers, as opposed to the boomers, the doomers, yeah, then we're in trouble.
Yeah.
Leave them with hope.
I don't want to be a 40-year-old doomer in a couple of years.
I don't want to be a 60-year-old doomer, so we're both on the same boat.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much again for being on my show. And anybody who's listening or watching, if you'd like more information, all of his links, I'll leave the links to The Optimistic American and the link to your book down in my show notes. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. You have a good day.
You too. Bye.